Are you participating because you're avoiding a consequence, or are you participating because you're anticipating a reward? And the couples where both anticipate a reward, gourmet sex is coming easier.
You're listening to Get Your Marriage On, the fun and spicy podcast bringing you new tools and fresh ideas so that you can be the sexiest couple you know.
Part of being an adult is unlearning the things that no longer serve you and learning new things that bring richer meaning to your life. When it comes to sex, there's a lot that isn't helpful that we can unlearn, and a lot we can learn to bring deeper meaning and joy to our most important intimate relationships. I had the pleasure of interviewing Cami Hurst, a talented and passionate certified sex therapist out of Boise, Idaho. We talk about how to make sex more nutritious and gourmet for the couple, why motives, or the why, around improving one's sex life is more important than the actual what you're doing, and what to do when your spouse has different sexual preferences than you do, and a number of other topics. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Cami Hurst, welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here too. We've tried to make this happen a few times.
Yes, it's been great. It's a long time coming.
Totally.
I'd like to start off the podcast with a little bit of foreplay. I want to know, what's your craziest story from your honeymoon?
Okay, so that's a fun question. So one story I have burned in my brain from our honeymoon, we thought we were prepared. We read the books, but none of them were helpful. None of the books were actually very helpful.
What books did you read? I'm just curious.
Oh, we did stuff from Bradshaw. I think we did they were all just analogies that actually were not practical or very helpful. Uh-huh. And we had come from a system where we were waiting and there was a lot of purity culture. And so we had made the assumption that if we did our part, it would work out. And it did not. And so,
what didn't work out, if I'm allowed to ask that?
Not much worked out. There was just so little education, right? So we had grown up here in Idaho where it's abstinence only education, and we'd grown up from our home church where we were waiting and we would be blessed and it would work out, and that is not helpful. So I have this memory, we're driving up and down the Oregon coast looking for a bookshop to try to find something more helpful. And we walked into this used bookstore, and the only thing that they really had was a Kama Sutra book. And I opened it and I glanced through it. I'm like, no, that is not what I'm looking for. Coming at me from a different angle is not going to be helpful, basically, which is what Kama Sutra is, which is a lot of geometry, a lot of different exploration, which is enjoyable now. But just back then, it just became so clear so quick that we didn't have any education, and we needed a lot of it. And so, that's a reason why I do what I do is the education was fought for. We really had to redo all of our learning and do a lot of unlearning. And that's what I do with a lot of clients in my therapy room is we're unlearning things that weren't helpful, and we're relearning things that would have been helpful, but we didn't have access to.
Oh, good. I love diving into this today. So I want to talk about the message for today is for couples that are otherwise in great marriages.
Yeah.
That I think sex would be happening a lot more if it was more enjoyable, more pleasurable, if they got more out of it. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just not happening that much. And it's so easy for sex to get low on the priority list with the stresses of work, children, mortgage, everything else that's going on. So I like to think that a lot of couples might be having fast food sex, if I could use that metaphor for a moment.
Sure.
It's kind of quick, in and out. It doesn't feed that great, but hey, I'm getting something in compared to maybe something a little more gourmet, something that takes a little more time to prepare and can kind of satisfy for a longer time. Does this framework work at all for talking about what we want to talk about today?
Yeah, I think food is the best analogy that we can use when we're talking about sexuality because we're so familiar with it, and we can understand it as a metaphor. It works for satiation and appetite and preferences and tastes. Food is a really great analogy to use when we're talking about sexuality. So yeah, perfect.
So, Cami, what can couples do to improve their, I guess, sexual palate, to improve their sexual nutrition? How
Yeah.
can we make sex more gourmet?
Well, one thing you said that really stood out was if there's something in it for the other person. You said that a second ago. And that's
Yeah.
a really excellent framework for trying to discover what your motivations are for participating in sexual activity. So when you look at like tests that have been done on mice and you think about a maze, the mice who are running through the maze toward cheese for a reward have a whole different experience, whole different set of chemicals being released from their brain than a mouse who is running through the maze trying to avoid an owl that is pursuing them.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's the same problem. We still have a maze that we've got to get through. But the mouse's experience and the chemicals that are flooding through their brain are incredibly different if they're running away from a consequence versus when they're running toward a reward.
Oh,
And
gotcha.
so one of those foundational ideas for couples that I'm asked that we sort through here in therapy or in any kind of education is, are you participating because you're avoiding a consequence, or are you participating because you're anticipating a reward?
Hmm.
In the couples where both anticipate a reward, gourmet sex is coming easier. There's something in it for both people. But oftentimes, because of the systems that are at play and because of our past experiences, you might have a couple where one is running toward a reward and one is running away from a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And coming away from sex having a completely different experience. Even though they had the same maze, they had the same experience, they lived it differently.
Gotcha. Within the marriage, within
Mm-hmm.
that relationship. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, what's an example of why someone might be engaged in sex like they're running away from an owl?
Well, I'm sure that's a huge
The
topic.
meanings they attach to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the meanings you attach to it, but also, hundreds. Like, well, then my spouse won't be grumpy. So I'm
Ah.
participating to avoid a grumpy spouse, or I'm participating to at least have that taken care of for 4 more days, or I'm participating because it's been long enough, or I'm participating because it's Valentine's Day and there's an expectation, or I'm participating because I'm supposed to like this, or I'm participating. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons why someone would be participating. And the motivation is avoiding a consequence instead of anticipating pleasure.
Gotcha. So I guess it's natural for people who can honestly say, I really don't like sex because it's always
It's
right.
going to reinforce it over and
Yes.
over and over.
Yeah. And
If
in the
we're
act of sex, you're just thinking about the reasons why you want to avoid it or hope to
Mm,
get through it,
mhm.
perhaps.
Yeah. And so one of the things we have to start doing is what would change the dynamic so you were anticipating pleasure, so it was like you were running toward the cheese, so there was something in it for you. And for a lot of couples, I'd say maybe half of my clientele are coming from a faith-based perspective and half of my clientele are not, but they all have systems at play where there's some pressure, and they're all have some system at play where they are blind to their own sexual personality.
Tell me more about that.
So I found one foundational idea is that sexuality is part of our wholeness, that it's just a piece of the pie, just another side of our dynamic. And I'll talk to people and say, okay, tell me about your social self. And they'll really quickly be like, well, I like these contexts. I don't like these contexts. This is when I really shine. These are ones that make me anxious. I'll be like, okay, tell me about your intellectual self. And they'll be like, oh, yeah. These are some of my like hobby pursuits. These are some of the rabbit holes. I can go really far, really deep. These are things that are stimulating. These are things that maybe are annoying, places I don't like to go. And if I say the same thing, tell me about your sexual self, and it's just like crickets. I think a lot of the systems at play as we develop, if you look at, I am a fan of existential therapy. And one of the existential crises we go through is isolation. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the dynamics of that is isolation from self. And I think we have a lot of adults where their development, their growing up, has created an isolation from their sexual self. Don't learn about
Meaning
that. Don't look at that. Don't know who you are sexually. It's not important, or it's dangerous, or it just isn't of value. And so you have an adult who knows themselves very well, socially, intellectually, spiritually, creatively, and know nothing about themselves sexually.
and the consequence. So what's the consequence of not knowing yourself sexually then?
Then it would be like going to the restaurant and having no idea what you want to order.
Ah, right.
What do you like? I don't know. I'm here for the other. I am told we're supposed to go out to dinner. I'm told I'm supposed to order something, but I don't know what I like. I don't know what I enjoy. I don't know anything about that. And so, sexual shame can have two outcomes. The one is, oh, I'm so ashamed that I have a sexual side, right? And every time my sexual side bubbles up, now I'm ashamed of it. But it can present in another way, which I see more often for women, which is, I've repressed that so much, I don't know about my sexual side. It doesn't bubble up. I'm ashamed because there is nothing there. Instead of I'm ashamed about what is there, I'm ashamed that there is nothing there. It's a blank void. It's a complete isolation from self.
So how do you help couples or individuals in that case who are the latter? They're like, I don't know what I want. I don't know what I like. How do you help them move towards more cheese and less owl?
Yeah, it takes a lot of exploration. And that's the first foundational belief, is this is part of my wholeness. This is a part of my humanness, that there is something in it for me. And creating that hope that is a side that they could embrace, right? And the second step, the second foundational idea really is creating individual ownership over your sexuality, where the idea that my body belongs to me and my sexuality is going to be unique to me, and my tastes and my preferences are going to be unique to me. And with the restaurant analogy, how do you create a gourmet meal? That is up to the consumer.
Yes.
I could go to a French restaurant and be given the most gourmet, amazing, expensive, perfectly prepared meal, and it be sat in front of me and me go, I don't want to eat the snails. I don't like snails.
Uh-huh.
I mean, my gourmet is going to be different than the gourmet of the person sitting next to me.
Yes. Got it.
And so there's a lot of exploration about what is gourmet. And it is different to the individual based on their own unique tastes and preferences. And we can't get to that exploration of a person's unique tastes and preferences without the foundational idea of sexuality is part of my wholeness, and sexuality is mine, and whatever is there is fine. And that would take us to the third foundational idea that I work with a lot of couples, that when we get there, when we're no longer scared to see what is there, and when we're no longer scared to discover our unique tastes and preferences and explore what gourmet to the individual is, some people are really worried that might threaten the relationship, right? Because
I see that a lot.
Totally. Because there's this assumption that sexual compatibility means what you like sexually is the same as what I like sexually. And I think that's a big myth. That isn't a helpful framework of thinking about it. I like to think about it as you are a sexual being and I am a sexual being, and we're going to create a Venn diagram where there's overlap. But the goal to ellipse each other sexually is just unrealistic and not very helpful. But we get really scared. What if my partner doesn't like my sexual tastes and preferences? What if my partner is scared by my sexual tastes and preferences? And so it really takes some establishment of, I'm sure, it really takes differentiation, where it's, I can be different than you and we can still be close. that
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to overlap each other's sexuality. And that doesn't mean we're not compatible, that we grow into compatibility instead of it being a given. And
Gotcha.
so those
There's
are
a lot of
those,
that.
yeah.
There's a lot of that fear of like, if I really were to express myself fully and sexually,
Mm-hmm.
he or she won't like it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'd
Mm-hmm.
have a hard time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, is there a hierarchy? Like, do I need to subordinate my sexuality to like the relationship and what keeps the peace between us? Or do I really express myself at the risk of maybe hurting my spouse's feelings by expressing what I want?
Yeah. And that's one of the tricky points of assuming sex will work out without having any sexual communication skills, is this idea that, well, now I know what I like, and so I'm just going to do it. That is not.
No.
No, we've got to have sexual communication skills. I think something that we all can learn from the kink community is how to have good sexual communication skills. That we're talking about our tastes and preferences before surprising our partner with something
they may not like. Right.
because that's not consent, right?
No.
So this idea that I can express myself without consent is problematic. And the missing piece is sexual communication skills. So first discovering who we are, what our gourmet might be like, and then talking about what might that look like as an exchange for us. How would we implement that so that it was cheese for you and cheese for me? It's just missing those communication skills of talking about sexuality before we're engaging. There's so much we can learn from the kink community that way about how to negotiate styles, tastes, preferences, and consent.
Any specific stories of maybe someone you've worked with about that, how they got really good at the sexual communication bit?
Yeah. So it's tricky first to just really understand, oh, that is a thing. We talk about this. I can even actually think about talking with another therapist, and the therapist is a marriage and family counselor, but has no sexuality training.
Uh-huh.
And he said to me, well, I was just so confused about what the couple needed because, sex just happens. Like one person just kind of non-verbally initiates and then it just happens. And I looked at him, I was just like, are you kidding me? You are working with couples with an assumption that it's all complete nonverbal and that that's normal and that that's how it should be. And I introduced him a little bit more to, consent, negotiation, sexual agreement, sexual communication skills. And it was kind of just blowing his mind, even though he's been working with couples for probably 20 years now. And so the first challenge is kind of obliterating the idea that this should be nonverbal. It should just happen naturally. This just is how it should be. It's very much like a PG-13 from the 80s idea.
Uh-huh.
Where there's no communication demonstrated. And so we'll work often through that with the introduction to the 6 sexual health principles. So the 6 sexual health principles are consent, non-exploitation, protection from STIs and unwanted pregnancy, honesty, shared values, and mutual pleasure. And the ones I'm working with couples specifically around communication skills are consent, non-exploitation, and mutual pleasure. It's not, unless there is an enthusiastic yes, it's not consensual. And we have to have these conversations, and it's much deeper than, do you want to have sex tonight? It's, what would you like tonight? I can imagine enjoying some penetration, or I'm really not in the mood for penetration, but maybe we could help get each other off. I'm too bloated, or where we have these communication skills about what we are consenting to and what would be mutually pleasurable. So what the cheese would be tonight for me might be different than what the cheese for me was last night.
Gotcha. So it's really focusing on what do you find pleasurable now, and just focusing on that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And having a communication structure about that. And none of us had this, I don't know anybody that really had this modeled well for us. For those of us who are in our 30s and our 40s, our parents' generation was not modeling consent. It was a lot of, give your aunt a hug. It was very much do your duty instead of would you like to have a hug? And so even from the beginning, we were modeled non-consensual touch. And so for the very first time, those who are our age are trying to learn it for ourselves and then teach it to our kids because it wasn't modeled to us.
Gotcha.
Go ahead. You had a question.
Oh, yeah. So earlier, I'm going to go back a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about how it is foundational to learn what you like,
mm-hmm.
to learn your own preferences, and then to see yourself as your sexuality as part of your wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a willingness component in all that? Like you need to be willing to kind of go there?
Oh, 1,000%. Because if you're wanting to discover yourself sexually as a response to an owl, as a response to my partner wants me to do this, someone else wants me to do this, I feel a lot of guilt or I feel a lot of pressure or it seems like everybody's enjoying this and I'm not, you're not going to have a dopamine flood. You're not going to have an oxytocin flood. You're not going to have a serotonin flood. It's going to be pressure, obligation, and pleasing. People do not build good sexual relationships on the foundation of pleasing or pressure or obligation. Those three ideas are the nail in the coffin to genuine desire. When I see somebody, male or female, engaging sexually out of obligation, pressure, or to please their partner, within months, they will have absolutely no sexual desire.
Oh, right. It kills all passion.
Because they're running from the owl. They're running from the owl instead of running toward the cheese.
There seems to be many marriages where just due to upbringing or whatever, like what you described earlier, like one of the spouses doesn't have a relationship to their own sexual self because of shame. And I like how you talked about the two sides of shame. One is like I see it, it's stereotypically the men like I'm ashamed to be sexual, and then the other one is I'm ashamed that
I don't think I am sexual.
I don't think I am sexual. So you kind of have that dynamic, and then they want to kind of correct that. So using stereotypes again, let's pretend it's the husband going to the wife saying, I think we need to go to sex therapy. What he's really saying is, I think you need to go
I want
to therapy.
To change you.
Yes, I want to change you because I want you to see that you want sex for yourself, not just to please me.
Yeah.
How do you help couples navigate that maze? That's a tricky maze to be in because you don't want to frame it as a do this for me. I want you to do it for you, but that's where you want to end up. But that's not what that's not the reality at present.
We're almost doing the opposite of what Dr. Laura's book, The Proper Care and Feeding of Husbands, is saying. Okay.
Right.
I hate that book. The worst book for a female desire to flourish. It's basically
it's all duty, obligation, and everything. Yes. I remember there was a line in there about if you can change your baby's diaper, surely you can have sex with your husband. And I cringed when I heard that.
Well, I not only cringe, but I get emotional because I see women experiencing sexual trauma through that
themselves
framework.
In situations they don't want to be in it.
And they develop trauma responses, even though their husband might be incredibly benevolent, incredibly generous, incredibly gentle. If the operation, if her motivation to engage is a form of self-betrayal, we will develop sexual trauma responses, whether or not there was an overt intention of harm.
Yes.
And so it not only makes me sick, it makes me a little emotional. It makes me really, really sad. And so that is the exact dynamic that we are working against, which is it has to be an internal authority motivator for, in your situation, which I've seen it go both ways, but it is more stereotypical for the female because of all the systems in which are at play as we developed in our youth. working to find the internal motivation instead of the external pressure to engage in embracing a sexual self as part of the wholeness. And a lot of times that will happen for a woman who's like, I think I do deserve to know that about me, whether or not it benefits my marriage. I deserve that for me. And often coming at it from a healthy degree of selfishness is where we need to come at it from. Of, I deserve this for me, whether or not it makes my husband happy, whether or not it, that as a human being, I deserve to understand this side of myself. And that's some place that we'll often start, and we won't start often with the relationship when there's been the complete void, the sexual void of I am not a sexual being. We will start without the husband. We will start with that. What do I like? I kind of like, that the Runaway Bride video where at the end, that movie, her journey is to figure out what kind of eggs she likes, because whatever fiance she's with, she likes eggs cooked the way they like them. Right. And so she leaves and she has this big self-discovery. And part of it is, I need to know how I like my eggs cooked. And it's that kind of thing where we'll start maybe with some lotion of, do you know how to connect with your body as a vehicle for pleasure? And people are like, what are you even talking about, Cami? Like,
those are big words.
My body is not a vehicle for pleasure. Okay, we will start there until there's an internal conviction and a personal anchoring that, no, my body is a vehicle for pleasure. Like putting lotion on feels so good. And this is the kind of lotion I like, and it smells. And these are the parts of my body that feel really good when I put the lotion on. I mean, we really go back to, do you believe your body can be a vehicle for pleasure? And what do you know about yourself specifically as a vehicle for pleasure? Before we can get to the gourmet, because a husband could be like cooking the right meal. He could be preparing it expertly. It could be amazing according to his tastes, and it never be the cheese for the partner. And so, just like I am not a fan of French food, it could be the most gourmet, amazing thing put in front of me. I'm not going to enjoy it, because guess what? My tastes and preferences are, I really love Mexican food. I really love Thai food. And it's that internal self-discovery piece that kind of has to happen first. Before we can serve a gourmet meal, we have to know what the unique tastes and preferences are of ourself, and then create the communication skills to share that with our partner. And you're right, it can be a big old ouch to the partner. Because they worked so hard at the French food. They read all the books, they did all the training, and now you're telling me you don't like that. That's a big old ouch. And that self-soothing is really important. Of, I need to learn how to take my partner seriously without taking them personally. Okay, you don't like French food. I'm going to take that seriously instead of personally. Okay. Right. And I saw in your men's course, I was looking through that's one of your weeks that you focus on, is that part of self-soothing.
Yes.
Of, I need to take my partner seriously instead of personally in order to progress.
Right. So what do those husbands do when they just feel like their wife won't take that step to find out? Like, it's almost like they're Puritans, to deny all pleasure. Like, no, pleasure's bad. Like, I'm not going to even find out what lotion I like. I'm not even
and it
going to
happens.
take
It
that
happens.
step. Yeah.
And timing matters. I've worked with people for like a few months, and then we hit a block, and I'm not upset that there's a block. I honestly do trust, and I've seen over time they're going to take a year and something will shift and I'll see them again. Timing really matters. This isn't a race course. I remember working with this couple, and him backing off was the key to her engaging from a place of self-authority. She had to know that he was honestly giving her permission for this to be about her instead of about him. I said, do not send her podcasts. Do not send her book lists. Do not, no. That is all external pressure.
Yes.
She's gonna feel that owl coming for her every time you say, listen to this podcast. Let's read this book. It's not gonna feel like running toward the cheese, And so he had to do a lot of work of surrendering that,
And a
letting
lot of
go of the
self-soothing.
control.
Yes.
A lot of self-soothing. And when she started to have some security that this was about her, for her, instead of managing his anxiety, then that opened up the doors for us to do some work. It's like, if coming back to this gourmet analogy, if I really love chocolate, but if I was met at the door every day with the same piece of chocolate cake, here's your favorite, eat it. It's not going to be very many days before I don't like that chocolate cake anymore.
Right. It takes the fun out of it.
It takes the fun out of it. It takes the wanting out of it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So the word desire just means wanting.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's so much pressure and so much here, there's no wanting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like people have to have enough space, enough autonomy, enough separateness to want something. And often in the dynamic of the pursuer, the sexual pursuer and the sexual withdrawer, it's really hard. It can be so scary to say, but if I stop pursuing, it's never going to happen.
Yes, I hear that myth all the time.
It is so hard to take the leap of trust of going, okay, but I have to let my spouse want something. Otherwise, they're just reacting to my pursuing. And that is not desire. That is responding, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I'm not saying anything new to what some other guests have said before, that we have to stop that pursuer withdraw dynamic sexually. And it takes so much surrender and so much self-soothing to stop that dynamic. But it's the one that's going to let off the pressure and let the partner engage authentically instead of out of a response to pressure.
Great. I want to talk more about learning about what you like and communicating that a little more. You talked about the kink community. People who may not be familiar with what that means or what that is, or they might have some preconceived notions of what that really is like. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Talk about what they're doing right and what the rest of us can learn from it.
Yeah. So it can be, scary. This idea that sex is dangerous or sex can be threatening is an idea we unpick and unlearn a lot. But the kink community is just a community of individuals who have come to accept maybe some of the fetishes or non-vanilla things that make up their sexuality and have made peace with it. And
the quote unquote weirdness side of all of us, I guess. Don't we all have a weird side of us when sexually speaking?
I think that our sexual selves all have uniqueness and all have fantasy and all have some type of fetishizing. Even if it's vanilla, even if we're a vanilla individual, there are things we like. There are things we prefer. We have tastes and preferences. Mm-hmm. The kink community maybe has tastes and preferences that are outside the bell curve.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So if we just think about it's all normal, but we've got a bell curve of vanilla, and then we've got, things on the
fringes.
Yeah. And the stereotype is that that's scary, but what the community does so well is, oh my gosh, their communication skills are so fabulous. Their consent skills are so fabulous. And people think, if you go to a sex dungeon, it's just like a free-for-all. And what is happening is in the kink community, they're doing more talking about sexual sex than they are having the sex. But it would look like, you can even pull up kink sexual agreements and look at the conversations these people are having of, what are you into? Is penetration anything you're into? What type of penetration? Is there anything orally that you're into? What kind? And they're having these discussions before they engage of what is the safe word, and what do you consent to and what don't you consent to. And oh my gosh, I wish we as a vanilla or religious or normal bell curve people were having these skills and having these conversations, because they prevent disappointing.
Serving snails when the other person hates snails.
Yeah. And it prevents trauma. It prevents negative experience. It prevents disappointment, because we have the expectation, what we're going into, of what would be gourmet today for me would be, and then we start to put things on the table, right? And I'm not sure. I think you developed an app. I'm not sure. But I mean, there are a lot of apps out here about yes, no, maybe lists. Mm-hmm. And that's really the conversation we're having. Okay, tonight, I would really love this, but I don't really want that. Oh, okay. And because we have sexual security, that fear of scarcity doesn't pop in, because we know that the menu changes frequently and we're not tied to these scripts. And, the script of intercourse is one that we can work around, because as we age and our bodies change, we are going to have to get more flexible about our definition of sex. My favorite definition of sex is connection and pleasure.
Mine too.
Yeah. My favorite book about that, who really coined that term, is Marty Klein, his book, Sexual Intelligence. And, that is the goal, is that we connected and we had some pleasure. And so, opening up those conversations, maybe with a yes, no, maybe list, maybe just starting out with what would you enjoy tonight, with consent, with boundaries, and the self-soothing skills to honor boundaries. That's one thing I see a lot, where people would come into my office and say, oh no, I have a ton of integrity. I'm a person of integrity. Honesty is one of my values, but consistently do not honor the sexual boundary their partner requests. They get in the moment and then are in their own sexual world and forget or don't care and don't honor the boundary that they set. Guess what? The kink community, we might label them as weird. Maybe we label them as perverse. They have so much sexual integrity. They would never cross a boundary that was set in the consent discussion beforehand. They would lose their place in that community. They would get kicked out and black labeled. I mean, before you can even think it,
they'd lose their rank.
They lose their rank. They lose their position in the community, because they did not have integrity to the boundaries and the consent agreement that they had. Man, I wish vanilla straight sheltered couples had this framework.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
I wish they had it. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And yes, it's in the Intimately Us app, and we call it the Sexploration list.
Nice. Okay. And it's basically a yes, no, maybe list, right?
Yes, no, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yep. You can comment back and forth, and it's fantastic for couples wanting to explore a little bit more different sexual behaviors. Like, it's a foundation to start that conversation.
Yeah.
Very good. So, Cami, here's a scenario. Let's say in a relationship, there's one or both spouses have somewhat of a high degree of anxiety around sexuality in particular. One spouse decides, like what you talked about, I really want to find out my own sexuality for myself. I want to grow and develop it for me. I really want to explore what I like. And they start taking some steps for growth, and it gives the other spouse a lot of anxiety about what they're doing or whatever. A scenario might be like one woman who's never really had a lot of pleasure in sex, never really has had a lot of orgasms, decides, I'm going to, self-explore a little bit to find out what kind of touch I really like. And it gives the husband a lot of insecurity about that idea. What counsel do you give couples going through that, especially the one with higher anxiety about sexual activity of their spouse?
Well, I think it's rooted in fear, and the fear is often unique to the person. Some of the fears I've seen people have, one, that might be outside of their religious agreements. One might be that if they found out what they like, that they would leave their partner or that maybe they would find pleasure alone and never want to have a sexual relationship with the other partner. And so, that anxiety really is rooted in fear of old ideas, ideas where, hey, you got to be having good sex or they'll go outside the marriage. Well, that's an integrity issue, not a sex issue.
Yeah. Definitely.
And so we'd really look at the root of the anxiety in that idea and whether or not the idea is rational, whether or not the idea is likely, whether or not the idea is helpful, what the goal is. Often the goal is for the other person's self-development and the relationship development. And so there can be a lot of soothing of bringing us back to the goal of, I want my partner to develop, whether or not that blesses me. That takes so much maturity, right? To let go of that selfishness of, well, I want them to develop, but only if it is
fits
good
in
for me.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, we've got some shifting to do around often old ideas about the point of relationship, or usually there's an internalized hierarchy there, right? And so do you really want your spouse to develop as a human, even if it doesn't help you? Okay, so we'll do some therapy around that. And, I'm sure you've recommended a lot of good books about like No More Mr. Nice Guy, that idea, or The Second Half of Life by Hollis, all these books about basically self-soothing and growing yourself up. That's another good book, Grow Yourself Up. And then the other idea is the fear that this will change our dynamic. And for a lot of stereotypical situations, like you mentioned, women in this situation, it can be really scary to the spouse to learn that, oh, you didn't want sex. It wasn't that you didn't like sex. It's you didn't like the kind of sex we were having.
Yes.
And you didn't like the kind of sex I was offering. And that can hit at an ego point.
Yes.
And so it's learning to want the growth in the relationship, even if that means hearing some hard things. And even if that means changing the idea that it's my spouse who has the problem to, oh, we jointly created this problem. Even though I was the high desire partner and I was sending the message that my low desire partner was the problem, now I have to shift to realize we co-created this problem. That neither one of us is more broken than another. That me not being curious about your tastes and preferences put us here also. It was me assuming my tastes and preferences were the right kind of tastes and preferences. And that because you didn't like what I was offering, the problem was with you.
Makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. And seeing your part in it takes a lot of humility, I think. Mm-hmm. You got to set your ego aside and to really, you got to look at myself in that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's sometimes hard to do. And I guess therapy helps with that, right? Helps see your blind spots.
It does. And there's a ton of value in developing yourself sexually, but you're right. There's a lot of anxiety about, is this okay? And loosening up the idea that, one of those foundational ideas I said was owning your own sexual self. So one idea that can often challenge that population is the idea that my sexuality is mine and my orgasm is mine. And that challenges a lot of people who have a foundational false belief that me having an orgasm is the responsibility of my partner, that it's their job to give it to me. And that is antithetical to the idea of sexual ownership of yourself.
Because it doesn't sound like coupled sex anymore when it seems like I'm in charge of my own orgasm. Or that's the idea, I think people think.
And in the past, the systems at play have wanted families to stay together. And so they've created this idea of sexual dependency, and that our sexual pleasure should only be given to us by our partner.
Uh-huh.
And that gets really tricky when we're looking at doing some good sex therapy because it's removing the idea that we should be able to influence and have ownership of our sexuality. So I think that idea makes it difficult to walk into the French restaurant, have the French cuisine put in front of us, and then we don't want to say we don't like it.
All right, because it takes the locus of control outside of
Yeah.
me and places it on our
Because I'm
circumstances.
supposed to like what my partner gives me. And then we start to feel all kinds of feelings when I don't like what you gave me. And then a lot of shame of, hey, I learned this about me. I actually like this different. And it really shakes some of those foundational ideas that we got from our upbringing, from our abstinence only education, and from our the churches of our youth. Those are the foundational ideas. The practical part of it looks more like, so I'll just give an example. So I'm thinking about a couple, and the woman was able to overcome anorgasmia with a vibrator, and that was really threatening to the husband.
Okay.
Because the husband had the foundational belief that I should be able to penetrate you and you have an orgasm. That only works for 30% of women. It's just an unrealistic idea. And so he was very threatened that she could have an orgasm, but with the vibrator, because he felt like, this isn't me giving you the orgasm.
Right.
And I had to get maybe a little honest with him that his favorite missionary style penetration based orgasm he was having had nothing to do with the wife. She was not giving him anything. He was in charge of the speed. He was in charge of the angle. He was in charge of the pressure. He was in charge of his own pleasure. She was not giving him anything other than being a warm environment that was nice.
Uh-huh. Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, so I had to get really honest. He thought she was giving him the orgasm, but he was completely in charge. He was completely in charge of every sensation he was getting, okay? But he didn't realize that. And so her using the orgasm, he had the opportunity to provide a nice, warm, safe environment. But just like him, she needed to be in charge of the angle. She needed to be in charge of the speed. She needed to be in charge of the pressure for her own pleasure. And it's very much like he was doing, but he didn't know that or didn't see it or had this framework that was limiting his understanding of who's in charge of the orgasm or who's in charge of the pleasure. What are your thoughts? I mean, that is a really open description and it might challenge some people's ideas. What are your thoughts, Dan?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. In many ways, coupled sex is masturbating with a partner, using the other partner's body.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
when you look at it that way, it might sound dirty or wrong, but what the beauty of sex, I think, is it's two people being vulnerable with each other. And what could be more vulnerable than stimulating and experiencing that, bring yourself to that point of pleasure and bliss and orgasm with another person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the beauty and bonding that. But how you get there, there's so many ways to get there. And if we're too limited, it's like a 1-lane road. You need more opportunities to get to that same destination, I think.
And if our definition of sex is connection and pleasure, there's a whole lot of ways to get there. It may or may not include penetration. It may not include an orgasm. It may or may not include a whole lot of things. It's going to be gourmet to the individual, to the tastes and the preferences and the agreements and the boundaries and the consent that the couple has had for that interaction.
Got it. Great.
And it really does take breaking down some of the archetypal ideas that our upbringing gave us about sex.
Good. And adopting good ones. That's great.
Unlearning the unhelpful stuff and relearning more helpful stuff. Yeah.
And so I'm glad you're listening to this podcast because I hope we help you, unlearn the bad stuff and learn more of the great stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
As we close up, Cami, I'm going to switch gears a bit and I want to ask you, what are your black belt sex tips?
A couple ideas. I'm a big nerd. I love to read. And so a lot of things I'll suggest would be, bibliotherapy books. There's a great book called, let's see, it's called Love Worth Making, How to Have Ridiculously Great Sex and Long-Lasting Relationships by Stephen Snyder. And then there's also a book called Magnificent Sex, Lessons from Extraordinary Lovers by Peggy Klein-Platz. Both are sex therapists. And Peggy's view is that great sex, the lessons we can have from extraordinary lovers across a lifespan, are that their relationship includes things like communication, empathy, vulnerability, connection, and being present in the moment. And those are probably those black belt skills. Are you able to keep checking back in with your partner? Do you have erotic empathy? Erotic empathy is a great term. It's actually like...
What's erotic empathy?
Erotic empathy is the ability to know your partner's tastes and pleasures, or tastes and preferences, almost like emotional empathy is, okay, it looks like I know you well enough that I can tell that maybe you're distracted. Let's talk about that. We're not scared to pause our sexual experience to connect to each other emotionally, that I'm not so disconnected from you and in my own erotic world that we're having lonely sex.
Okay.
So, erotic empathy is it's a term coined by a sex therapist in Canada, and it's actually a TM. So I want to make sure that it's not attributed to me at all, because it is a copyrighted term. And I think that erotic empathy is probably what separates, the great lovers from the people who are having sex together. Where I know my partner's inner world. I know my partner's inner tastes and preferences. I know we've had enough communication that I can tell when they float away from me, and we can have a conversation to bring each other back to the moment, back to our exchange together. Or I see them floating away and I know where they're going, and I'm so thrilled I can help them go there. Maybe we're not threatened by our partner going somewhere mentally, and we're thrilled that we can help them go there because we understand their inner world, right? But it's really that amount of understanding our partner's sexual inner world. We're not threatened by it. We know it's theirs. We're happy to play in it with them. They're happy to play in ours with us. And we've really maximized that Venn diagram of overlapping your erotic map with my erotic map without feeling threatened by it. I think that probably is the black belt skill, is erotic empathy of, we've worked through what felt threatening, and we recognize where we overlap sexually, and we're not threatened by the areas where we don't.
Love it. Erotic empathy. There you have it. That's good.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. If people want to reach out to you, connect with you, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah. So probably my website is camihurst.com. And my email there is cami@camihurst.com. I'm not taking any clients for the next 12 months for new therapy clients, but I am providing and opening up, and would be ecstatic if anyone wanted to join. I've got 2 courses that I'll be doing in 2022. One course is called Becoming Orgasmic, and it's for women who experience anorgasmia, which is the rare experience of, or the difficulty reaching, or the have never reached orgasm. It's incredibly treatable. 30% of women are anorgasmic, and it's incredibly treatable through psychoeducation and support. It's going to be a small group, only 8 women in each group, to help foster some safety and security. It's a 6-week group. It'll be online and open to anyone in the country. And then my second group will be called From Purity to Pleasure, which is 4 couples. I'll do a minimum of 8 couples to foster some security and safety and privacy. And the same thing, an 8-week group where we're kind of breaking down some of these ideas that we may be picked up from as we were influenced by our families and our churches and our abstinence-only schools. And same thing, it'll be live, online, 8 weeks. And those are 2 courses that you can enroll in at my website, which is camihurst.com.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Get Your Marriage On. And if you did, we would love it if you would take a few seconds to give us a rating on iTunes and to share the show with your friends. They'll thank you for life. Once you've done that, you can head over to getyourmarriageon.com for more resources about today's topic and to download our amazing marriage apps. Now go get your marriage on.